Native Americans and Manifest Destiny.
Soon after the Constitution was ratified, Americans wanted to expand westward from the original 13 colonies. Some of that land, though, was inhabited by Native Americans.
At first, the federal government recognized the tribes as separate nations and agreed to take land only through treaty. In reality, a familiar pattern happened. White settlers would push west into Indian territory, and the U.S. government would use legal maneuvers to redraw treaty lines or find other ways to force Native Americans further west.
Some Native Americans, like the Cherokee, tried to assimilate into American culture. Others tried to fight back, but most of them felt that they had no choice but to leave the land or be killed.
By the 1820s, more than 125,000 Native Americans lived east of the Mississippi, in the forest and prairies of the Southeast. In 1824, the U.S. government established the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA to its rapper friends, to manage the government's relations with the Native American populations.
When President Jackson took office in 1829, he wanted to settle the area currently inhabited by Native Americans. Jackson adopted a policy of removing Native American tribes from the area, however possible. This policy favored by Jackson's biggest fans, poor farmers in search of more land to use.
Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, authorizing the transplanting of the East Mississippi Indian tribes. The act was strongly supported by the South, where all of the Indian tribes were living. In the next several years, the 5 tribes in the area would be made to resettle west of the Mississippi, called Indian Territory then. The government used new treaties, money, and sometimes force to carry out the eviction.
The state created a series of laws that basically took away the rights of the Cherokee people and then told them to leave the state.
The Cherokees requested an injunction, arguing in court they were a foreign nation and thus not subject to Georgia's laws. The Supreme Court basically punted, saying they didn't have jurisdiction over the legal issues at hand. The Cherokees were at the mercy of the state of Georgia.
The forced removal of the Cherokees, the last tribe to leave, began in 1835. About 4,000 out of 15,000 Cherokee died in detention camps and on the route, later called the Trail of Tears. Millions of acres of land were now free for settlement by another people.
Boosting the practice of Indian removal was the idea of manifest destiny, popularized by a New York journalist in 1845. Manifest destiny is the notion that Americans had the God-given right to expand their empire. It was part of the national destiny. This belief helped rationalize the removal of Native Americans from the lands they inhabited.
Another rationalization was the common view at the time that Native Americans were savages and inferior to white Americans. This was similar to the view that Southerners held about slaves, and it helped justify discrimination against both groups.
The expansion west would continue for decades until settlers hit the coast. Driving the expansion were both Americans and immigrants seeking cheap land and new opportunities. What was called Indian Territory would steadily shrink over the century.
For example, the United States had declared that all of the land west of the 95th meridian to be Indian Territory. However, as settlement grew in the west, Congress passed a law in 1851 creating yet another home for Native Americans, reservations in what's now modern-day Oklahoma.
A reservation is a piece of land maintained by the Native Americans living on it, under the authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Basically, the government sectioned off pieces of land and allowed Native Americans to live on them, but under the authority of the government.
In the 1881 publication, A Century of Dishonor, Helen Hunt Jackson wrote about the injustice that had been dealt to the Native Americans by our national government. Her work spurred a national movement that protested these acts, but in many ways it was too little, too late.
In 1887, Congress passes the Dawes Severalty Act, which wiped out tribal ownership of land and gave it to heads of Native American families. The act reflected the view at the time that Native American culture was a roadblock to becoming, quote, civilized, assimilated into white culture. One of the treaty's effects is that by 1900, Native Americans lost 50% of the land they held just 2 decades earlier.